World of Wellness. I'm your host today and this week, Jamie Dorley, with my co-host, the one and only, the Godfather of Nutrition. Welcome back, Joe Messino.
Oh, pleasure. Let's roll, baby.
And this is a special event. This is the Wine of Wellness Week number 98.
Ooh.
Two more. We're going to hit the centennial mark this year. Not in age, of course, but number of events we've done. So the Wine of Wellness Week is the legacy of Dr. James Weiner, the co-founder of Nutritional Frontiers, the founder of the Pain Release Clinic, and of course the Weiner Wellness Center. And we do these events 5 times a year to help create a community place that people can come together and make themselves optimize their wellness program. Right, Joe?
Absolutely. The Wellness Week is unmatched anywhere in the country. I haven't seen a single center or clinic that's been able to do an entire week of free workshops, free food, great discounts, smoothies, and samples for an entire 7 days.
And I tried one of those Messino Cafe Mocha Proticinos today. Dr. Bob, you're going to love those. And Joe, we got a special guest. I don't want to take up too much time because me and you can talk forever. This guy's an international icon, and not only is a doctor of chiropractic, he's a certified clinical nutritionist. He's a diplomat from the International Applied Kinesiology and the International Council of Nutrition. His resume goes on forever. If I list it all, it'll look like alphabet soup here. He has been a leading speaker. I love the old days when it was him and Dr. Jeff Bland as the dynamic duo when they would go out and do their seminars together. And I was so lucky to be the regional director at Metagenics and welcome these guys into Orlando. Always sold out events. Mm-hmm. He has taught over 10,000 functional medicine doctors in his career. Wow. And he didn't stop there. He's helped launch Organo Coffee to a premier organic natural coffee. I love how he asked, healthy coffee or no coffee? So we're so happy to have him back on not only the Wellness Week, he's going to be our featured speaker, our professional training event for Nutritional Frontiers in October. And we're so blessed to have him come back. So welcome, Dr. Bob Rakowski. How are we doing, Bob?
You know what? I'm epic. It's a beautiful, amazing day in here's Houston, Texas. You know what? And every day is a good day to get better, stronger, faster, smarter. So let's dive in because we've got some strategies that are absolute slam dunks.
You know, I love it. So take it away, Bob, and we're going to follow along with you.
I love the intro. You know, Dr. Jeff Bland and I would often reference this article in the Archives of Internal Medicine, 1989, where they said, look, if you had this deadly quartet, if you had a big belly, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high blood fat, you were going to die early. But we came to realize that, my gosh, that's really missing the boat. Those are symptoms. Those aren't causes. And if we go to the next slide, we'll have the picture of what I call the actual deadly quartet, which is stress, toxins, malnutrition, and physical inactivity. You know, and what I tell people is if we do a stress reset with people, we've got an absolute slam dunk. We'll show what the medical literature shows, but nearly everybody walking around has cortisol resistance, and that makes them chronically inflamed and chronically immune suppressed. And when we reset that, which we can do fairly quickly, and you've got the best products in the market to do that, we make super fast change. But if we couple that with the detox, look out, because the symptoms of chronic poisoning, fatigue, sleep disturbance, intestinal distress, allergy symptoms, headaches, confusion, anxiety, all these things are the things that are really killing people. So let's go to the next slide. And I won't read this to you, but this was one of the best write-ups ever on the effects of chronic stress. Jeff Bland wrote it when he and I did a series in 2002. And here's what I'll tell you. When people are stuck in chronic stress mode, everything from head to toe is absolutely disrupted. When we start talking about the brain, people can't focus. They don't experience joy. They're depressed. They don't have anywhere near as much anxiety. We start working our way down and we find like thyroid and metabolism are absolutely impaired. We get down a little further. We see the cardiovascular system. You know, stress can increase blood pressure, blood lipids, inflammatory process, which is a major risk. You go down a little lower and the digestive system is really compromised. And then, you know, lower yet, we get to the sexual function and sex organs. You know, I'll quote Dr. Ruth Westheimer from many decades ago. She said, you're either, you know, the most important sex organ is between your ears. And if you're under stress, you might have some sexual dysfunction as well. So let's go to the next slide there.
But Dr. Bob, I like what it says in the very first sentence. Prolonged stress from multiple sources. And how many of those sources are probably people are not even aware of?
Yeah, external, right?
Right.
When we do look at that, I tell people one of the biggest stressors is indoor air and blue light. And blue light especially is known to enhance cortisol. But now keep in mind, this reference here was before the pandemic. Basically, 3/4 of all medical visits related to stress. And now we're much, much, much higher with substance abuse and poor eating and you name it. It's gotten much worse over these last few years. So, but I think throughout time, if we go back and we look at skulls from cavemen, those that had bruxism, grinding of the teeth, they can estimate very accurately the skeletal aging. People that were under the most stress died about 15.4 years early. So this is nothing new. It's just gotten worse over time. And so there's a new term called cortisol resistance. A lot of people have heard of insulin resistance. But what I tell people is that bodies ignore constant stimuli. So when you get stuck in a fight or flight mode with you have cortisol being released all the time, the body will actually ignore the signal of cortisol to extreme detriment. Next slide. And so, if we were going to ask the question, who pays for fight or flight? Literally the whole body's going to pay for it. But let's go and just focus on, at rest, the organ that gets most blood flow, liver. Number 2, kidneys. Number 3, brain. So those are the big 3 that are hit. So we're not going to detoxify. We're not going to filter the blood. We're not going to experience joy. And we can have challenges with focus. Next slide. So I really like this graphic in some ways, just to illustrate to people what really happens. The brain, again, gets so much blood, but under stress, your body says, okay, I don't have the luxury of joy. I don't have the luxury of complex thought process. I'm just going to go into my primitive brain and use the rest of that blood to fight or flee. And that's profoundly detrimental. Next slide. So, interestingly enough, there was a reference years ago that said there's universal agreement that 50 to 75% of all depression is stress-induced. And by the way, we also see that anxiety is very similar as well. Next slide. And it's suggested that depression is the top disability on the planet. And the reason I mention that is one of the most profound strategies to get people feeling better in their body, in their brain, and about their world is this stress reset. Next slide. So stress, definitely something that is going to impact all of your life choices. And people, they often find that they're just stuck. So we get them unstuck, and we get them unstuck quick. Next slide. And you start looking at how the pandemic has increased depression and mental health challenges all over the globe. I think, the world is beginning to wake up to that, and the need to be very proactive about everything that we do, especially hard-hitting things that'll make fast changes in our health. Next slide. So next slide as well. Females a little more than male, a little more than 2 to 1. And here's what we know. When people have chronic stress, it makes them depressed. It also shuts down the immune system. And I want you to think about that. When the immune system is dysregulated, not only is there a risk of, infection, but long-term, that risk is the risk of cancer, which turns out to be the top concern of people before the age of 55. After 55, they're concerned about their brains. Next slide. And the stress reset enhances both of those. They used to call it psychoneuroimmunology. Well, now they call it neuroimmunoendocrinology. And very, very simply, what they begin to see is when that stress is nonstop, the nervous system is disrupted, the hormonal system is disrupted, especially thyroid, adrenals, and sex steroids, gonads, and the immune system is shut down, and the body gets stuck in a chronically inflamed state and a chronic pain state. Next slide. So interestingly enough, when you start looking medicine's approach antidepressants, 1 in 7.4 people will respond to the antidepressant, 1 in 4.8 will have a negative side effect from an antidepressant. Next slide. So what we see is the chronically stressed are chronically sick, chronically inflamed, chronically tired, chronically unmotivated. And those are all things that we can get a quick handle on with stress reset. Next slide. And we've known for 50 years that stress is immunosuppressive. Next slide. And the very first cell that's affected by the chronic stress reset is going to be the natural killer cells. Those are cells that kill cancer cells as well as viral infected cells. Next slide. And stress can make you fat by multiple mechanisms. Next slide. And probably one of the things that people do is they start reaching for comfort food, which I've termed discomfort eating. And what they do when they eat these sugars with insulin resistance, they're a lot more prone to becoming progressively fat and inflamed. Next slide. And they've shown.
Quick question. I have a quick question on the last one. Can we go back to that? Because this is very common. Is the reason they're doing that comfort food because it's stimulating some things in the brain, some neurochemicals that they're almost getting there and then it gets worse? Is that what you see?
Yeah, so it is a dopamine stimulant. And so, a Dr. Lustig with the University of San Francisco, California, he has a nice documentary called The Skinny on Obesity, but he says basically sugar is a drug, Candace Pertzig as well. And so you'll actually have tolerance and withdrawal. So the more frequently you eat sugar, the more sugar it takes to get the same effect. And then you get to the point where you back off the sugar and your body is actually needing it. And it's a dopamine hit in the brain. Maybe we'll come back and do another World of Wellness where we talk about addiction dopamine and the rock solid natural strategies we have for that, because it's a big problem for our world.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Next slide. And we'll go to the one after that as well. So when we start looking at this phenomena of cortisol resistance, what they've said now in the medical literature is, look, when people have this cortisol resistance, they're not going to get better unless there's some type of anti-inflammatory therapy. Now, the sad news is when drugs do that, they cause more side effects. But when we do it, we have profound side benefits. And if we can go back and share the next slide, we'll start diving into the actual hard science behind the stress reset. So next slide as well. And as people become progressively ill, cortisol resistance progresses more. Next slide. So this was a powerful article talking about the link between systemic chronic inflammatory process and essentially all of the major maladies that are disrupting our world. If we were to look at the left and break this down, we'd actually find that it's stress, toxins, malnutrition, physical inactivity are all that deadly quartet that are related to this systemic chronic inflammatory process. But when it runs unchecked, it leads to prediabetes, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, depression, autoimmune diseases, neurodegeneration, breakdown of muscle and bone, and destruction of the immune system. Next slide. And ultimately, and the next one after that, one of the best things that we can do for this chronic inflammatory process, if we go back to the previous, is the specialized pro-resolvin mediators. And when we get to talking through our protocols, I'll share some cases, but I had a stage 4 cancer patient this last week. Actually 2 weeks ago is the first time I saw her, and medicine was sending her home to die. The cancer had metastasized to the colon. It was really compressing off, and they said, look, we're going to have to put a colostomy bag in. You can't eliminate on your own. She was losing weight, and essentially getting ready for hospice. We put her on a stress reset, a detox with high doses of these SPMs. And literally at 2 weeks, if I had a release, I would have filmed her and shared it. But I said, 0, no change, 100 perfect ideal. How much better are you? She says, at least 50%. She said, I can't believe how much energy I have, how good I feel. She says, I have 2 normal bowel movements every day, toothpaste-like consistency. I can actually see that I can get better. And when we show what the stress reset will do, the detox will do, and I want to really jump in on these SPMs, these ought to be a standard part of any protocol for anybody, but especially those that are dealing with a chronic illness. Next slide, please. So we start looking at
I'm sorry, can you please give us your elevator speech to your patients when they ask about what is an SPM or what does it do?
Yeah, well, it's probably like a 2-minute speech rather than a 30-second speech. But I tell them because stories stick. Dr. Serhan at Harvard asked an interesting question 2 decades ago. He said, I wonder if there's more to the omega-3 story. Because we've known since the 60s they prevent heart attack, stroke, and cancer by 13 different mechanisms. But Dr. Serhan injected radio-labeled omega-3s into rats. And he said, I wonder what it does in the body. And here's what he found out. The healthiest rats converted the omega-3s to a further downstream molecule that ultimately became named resolvins. Because literally everything that the rat was exposed to, it could be depression, infection, injury, cancer, physical trauma, resolved faster. Then he said, I wonder if humans have something similar. And sure enough, humans do it as well. The healthiest humans made the most resolvins, the sickest made the least. And where he got nominated for a Nobel Prize, now this was nearly 15 years down the road in his research, he said, what? I wonder if we can create a series of enzymes in the labs to convert the omega-3s to resolvins. He did it. He patented the process, got nominated for a Nobel Prize, and there's now over 1,500 PubMed studies on resolvins for all the conditions that I mentioned and many, many more. And so it's a must. It's got to be part of everybody's protocol. So back to our stress reset, and we're going to show where Nutritional Frontiers really shines across the board in stress reset, detox, resolvins. But first thing I like people to know is that melatonin actually calms the adrenals. Next slide. And it's also powerfully anti-cancer. We go back the last couple of decades and we've come to realize melatonin is a universal mitochondrial antioxidant. It's even in single-celled organisms, and it's a universal anti-cancer agent, and it prevents the 10 hallmarks of cancer in all types of cancer. This is something that I think once the world catches on, we start doing more melatonin consistently, we're going to prevent a lot of these cancers. Next slide, please. And it does not have any toxic effects. So what they could do with animals, they wouldn't do this with humans, but they infused about half of their body weight of melatonin into their bloodstream daily for weeks on end without any toxic effects. So that would, 1,000x anything that we're going to put in orally. Next slide. Theanine now, and you've got the sun-theanine, which has so many different advantages, but here's an amino acid in green tea that's known to prevent calmness without promoting drowsiness. Next slide. And it's known to be a natural GABA increaser. So when people study neurochemistry, GABA is considered the most calming neurotransmitter, and it has so many different brain benefits, health benefits, anti-seizure benefits. And sadly, most of us, that's our primary neurologic imbalance, according to Jay Lombard with Cornell. We did a brain series in 2009. He said easily this is the top brain chemistry abnormality in our entire society. Next slide. So now we've got your calm day, and we've got the activated form of B6, which is important for the conversion of glutamate to GABA. We've got the B5 helpful there as well, but also for keeping the adrenals strong. We got straight up GABA, so direct calming effect on the brain. And then, glycine also is known as an anxiolytic promoting GABA, and glycine has another benefit. It's one of the 3 amino acids that can go into making glutathione, glutamine, glycine, and cysteine. Taurine, again, a cofactor to convert glutamate to GABA. And then we've got that sun-theanine form. So absolutely powerful. And what you've done is taking something really good and made it great plus, plus, plus. Next slide. Then when we start looking at the sleep time, and I like people to take straight up melatonin during the day, this more or less at night, because I find plenty of people get drowsy straight up on melatonin. But if people can handle this, especially with the 5-HTP and the sun-theanine, this is an absolutely phenomenal product. But for sure, sleep will be enhanced with this. Next slide. When we talk about reishi, also known as Ganoderma, it's called the herb of spiritual potency. Next slide. And it's absolutely known, and this is phenomenal, May 2022, so we don't get much more recent than this. They knew it was very, very calming to the body, mind, and spirit, but they finally studied what was its effect on serum cortisol, and it actually lowers serum cortisol beyond powerful. Next slide. And it also has anti-anxiety and antidepressive and even anti-seizure activity. Next slide. And so this is a fun story. This little gentleman's name is Braden. He had a head injury as a neonate, and he was having seizures. So mom brought him in at 5 years old, having massive convulsive seizures in spite of taking 2 seizure meds. Medicine was failing. He was having elevated liver enzymes and an increased amount of seizures. We put him on a stress reset that he could do, a detox that he could do, and other things like Ganoderma infused hot chocolate and things like that. Within 6 months, off of medications, seizure free. Fun picture there, kissing my associate doc at the time. Next slide. And so how are we going to create this stress reset? We're going to do our Calm Day, our melatonin, and our Ganoderma spores every waking hour for 7 to 10 days. And I'll give the qualifying factor. You know, that stage 4 cancer patient, I put her on this reset and a detox. She said she felt 50% better. But I'll share with you, it was about 4 days into it. You know, she sent me a message and said, I can't do this. You know, I don't have any energy. I can't function through the day. What do you recommend? You know, my reply back was very straightforward. If you've got something more important than your health that you need to prioritize, well, then back off on this. But if your health's your top priority, keep going. Well, by day 7, she turned the corner and started feeling way better than she had in a long, long time. By day 10, 50% better. I also had a 541-pound man, and I did him a video of him on my Facebook Live. And it's interesting. Stress reset, detox. He lost 9 pounds in 10 days. We're now about 6 weeks in it. He's 29 pounds lighter. But at 10 days, I asked him. I said, 0, no change, 100, perfect, ideal. How much better are you? I was shocked. He actually said he was 80% better. And I said, wait a minute. Our goal is to get you down to 200 pounds. How can you be 80% better? He said, you don't understand. My knees used to hurt so bad. It was hard to even stand up. Now I don't have that level of pain. I can stand up. I can walk around more. My brain feels better. My whole body feels better. So think about that. 2 extreme cases responding absolutely beautifully. I think we're going to transition to detox.
On that. Let me ask you a question on you on the lady prior, where the first 4 days, where she said she had no energy on the program and protocol. What was that? Was that the body dumping out toxins, or was what?
That's a good guess. Do we know for sure? No, but a couple of things. One, when you detox, symptoms of chronic poisoning, number 1 is fatigue. So releasing toxins, that's going to reduce your energy. But also, a lot of these chronically unwell people have a leaky brain. And so since our gut makes 400 times the melatonin as the brain, it doesn't likely cross the blood-brain barrier. But when you have a leaky brain, you put that melatonin in, boom, people feel like they need to take a nap. Well, when they are complete in our protocol, which is almost always a complete detox and the stress reset, once they get past that, they begin to realize that they feel better than they have in a long, long time. And when we correct that leaky brain, we can prevent challenges down the road.
And what is some of the more common? I know some of the times we work with the patients at the wellness center. In the past, if they're really toxic, I would have them just change their diet first, because inevitably they blame the product, right? So do you see that a lot, where just the withdrawals of the sugar, the caffeine, whatever it may be, creates a lot of stress on them because their body is really craving these things?
Well, it is, but there's a couple of different ways of going after it, and I tend to be more of a drill sergeant in that respect. Listen, if you want to drag your feet, there's a chance you're not going to get better. But if you really want to hit this, let's do it. And, I tell people, Charles Poliquin and I taught a number of seminars around the world, and it was a lot of fun. And he would tell his trainers, look, if you hurt your client, you lose them. But I would actually jump in with I said, look, I'm going to tell you the opposite of that. And people thought, wait a minute, you're going to tell me to hurt my client? I said, no. If you don't help your client, you're going to lose them. And people are very impatient. Most people want to be better yesterday. And when they tell me, oh my gosh, I feel lousy, usually the first words out of my mouth are, man, that's awesome. It's working, you know? And then, you know, we can buffer it more, we can back it off, or we can plow through it, or maybe a combination of all the above. And I encourage my patients, and I have, you know, for nearly 30 years at this point, let's plow through it, because when you're on the other side, you're going to be glad you didn't drag your feet.
That's a great advice. Thanks.
You're welcome. And by the way, you know, we're partnered in not only Ganoderm in terms of capsules, but in terms of coffee and tea. And why do we do that? Any program is only as good as its compliance. When we step people's game up and we have them drink these, I call them guilt-free and turbocharged, because if we'd have a longer talk about this, at least half a dozen blood sugar benefits, brain benefits, anti-inflammatory benefits. People can even drink a latte or a mocha and lose fat, which is so fun. Next slide. So we're going to transition into our toxic world. Next slide. And here's the sad reality. It's estimated that about 1/4 of all maladies on the planet are related to chemical toxicity. Next slide. So we've all heard that cleanliness is next to, and I would fill in the blank, godliness. Next slide. And if we go back a couple thousands of years, the goddess of good health, her name was actually Hygeia. So hygiene, cleanliness is next to godliness. But, you know, this is fascinating detective work. Once I read it, I was beyond amazed. But we go back to 1900, and the average life expectancy was 47.3 years. Then we go fast forward over 100 years, and it jumped up to 78.2. You know, and people are thinking, okay, it's got to be that we're doing so much better with infection, but that's not what it is at all. Or, well, it is, but it isn't, right? We'll get to why we're better. Next slide. So the Black Death killed anywhere from 30 to 50% of England's population. Next slide. But conditions were absolutely prime for the Black Plague. As this writing says, the streets were narrow and flowing with sewage. So when we didn't have public sanitation, public hygiene, and good plumbing, it was just a breeding ground for pestilence. Next slide. So Henry Ford came along. If we look at 1881 New York City, that's actually horse manure in the middle of the street. Next slide. And an estimated, next slide, 2.5 million pounds of horse manure every single day. And it's fun to read these old texts. And you know, some people will get a laugh out of this, but they said, where would New York be in 100 years? And they basically said it would be buried under manure. Next slide. Well, Henry Ford, when he came up with his Model T, next slide, and then actually the world started employing it, what we found was an absolute straight linear drop in death rate from infectious disease. And if you look at that graph closely, a 75% reduction before antibiotics, a 91.25% reduction before vaccines were, you know, widely used at all, and then essentially no drop since then. Next slide. So the question that I've asked doctors for years, and I ask this of my patients too, if cleaning up the external environment led to such a dramatic increase in longevity, what will happen when we clean up the internal environment? And what we know is that this is one of the most universal steps to get people back to good health. Next slide. And so when we look at how big the problem is, we already talked about 25% of the global problems. Next slide. But there are over 80,000 registered toxic chemicals in the environment. And when they study them for toxicity, they study them one at a time, not in combinations. Next slide. And it's actually estimated through the human toxin inventory that every man, woman, and child walking around has over 700 toxins in their bodies at all times. And so newborn infants, according to the Environmental Working Group, they looked at umbilical cord blood. Every single one of them was exposed to over 200 toxins before they took their first breath. Next slide. And this is related to autism and other progressive challenges that are really plaguing the world. Next slide. So again, 1/4 of all health challenges related to toxins. Next slide. And the symptoms of chronic poisoning, classically, we go back to 1996 with this: fatigue, sleep disturbance, intestinal distress, allergy symptoms, headaches, confusion, and anxiety. And when I read that article in 1996, I looked at the list. I said, oh my gosh, if we didn't have these symptoms, I'd have to do something else for a living, because literally that's what everybody's coming into my door with. Next slide. And so now we start looking forward at different markers of toxicity and even of diabetes. And you'll see that the proliferation of these synthetic chemicals exactly parallels the increase in diabetes in our world. Next slide. And it's also known that these are directly related to the obesity pandemic as well. Next slide. And so they call it diabesity. The obese and the diabetic, a direct correlation between poisoning of the body with synthetic chemicals and both of these circumstances arising. Next slide. And since toxins interrupt mitochondrial function, we throw fatigue in there. So people are getting fat, they're getting depressed, they're having blood sugar problems. That increases their cravings, and then they don't have energy to move around because they're inflamed and their mitochondria are poisoned. And what do we have? But just a formula for disaster. Next slide. So one thing that I've told people for decades is bodies respond to frequency, duration, intensity, quality, and timing of stimuli. And that's why we dose so many things every waking hour. And I'll tell you what, and Jamie, it looks like you want to have a question. I'll have people come in and let's say, they were fighting a common virus, and they say, well, yeah, I'm going to take a vitamin C, a vitamin D, a zinc, maybe some reishi or Ganoderma. And they want to do it once or twice a day and expect to get better fast. And I would use all those things for people with viruses every waking hour. And what we found was nobody in my hundreds in my patient base even had to go to the hospital when they employed natural remedies with frequency, duration, intensity, quality, and timing. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, I remember years ago you had started the conversation at one of your events, one of his seminars, Joe, where you said, what comes first, the toxin or the fat cell, right?
Yep.
So that was kind of early on in this whole detox and weight loss. So, here we are 15 plus years later. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because it seems like now these toxins have gotten worse. They're more stubborn to release from the body. And now when you compound things like the xenobiotics, Roundup with the toxins from food, it's almost like, where do people go, right? Because they're so inflamed.
Well, and they are. So now we start looking at that. What has the data shown? When people lose fat, they actually release these toxins. And Jeff Bland made a simple statement. He says, look, if you promote weight loss with fat loss without promoting detox, you ought to be considered guilty of malpractice. Because when people are going to lose that fat, they are going to poison themselves if we don't have what we need on board to clear it out. And so what have we seen? That we had early markers of that a couple of decades ago, and it's gotten much worse since then. People like trivia, there was a project called the Biosphere Project, and they put people in there, and they're trying to create this dome that would function independently of the Earth's atmosphere. It turned out to be a disaster. It actually couldn't sustain itself without the elements of the wild, but they did all kinds of very sophisticated measurements of people in the biosphere. And once they started losing fat, they realized that their body was excreting toxins that were nowhere in the biosphere, and they realized it was in their bodies. And then fast forward, most environmental toxins are fat soluble. And if you're going to break down the fat, you're going to release these toxins. And if you don't buffer yourself against it, you might be worse off than you started. Let's go to the next slide. So, if people are stuck, metabolically stuck, stress stuck, detox stuck, weight stuck, blood sugar stuck, brain chemistry stuck, it takes more than just a nudge to get them out of that. And that's why I'm a big fan of doing whatever it takes to get them out of there quick. So when I would share this with patients, I say, look, let's say you want to be helpful and you come by and you give this guy a little push and, he hits the gas. What happens? Well, he even digs a deeper rut. And that's not what we want to have happen. We want to give people enough of a push to climb out of their challenges. Next slide. So this is just for appreciation of what goes on in the liver. And there's probably even more than what's shown in this graph, but we tell people detox is nutrient dependent, energy dependent, protein dependent. And a lot of people miss that protein factor. You know, I'll have people say, well, I'll just do a fast or I'll do a juice fast. The cytochrome P450s are all proteins. That's phase 1 of liver detoxification. And once you're in a protein fast, after 24 hours, you shut down the activity of those enzymes 50%. And that's just within 24 hours. Now we keep it going on days on end. You are probably going to get yourself in bigger trouble than you started. Next slide. So I recommend twice each year, 7 to 10 days of detox nutrients, and we'll share our Power Cleanse formula and the accessories that we're going to use. And during these 7 to 10 days, I recommend only organic, non-starchy vegetables. We want to be very low glycemic index. We want the fiber. We want to alkalize. And when we do that, people, again, have pretty miraculous changes. Next slide. And keep in mind, you know, people are thinking a lot about the liver, but it's also the skin and the intestines and the kidneys and the lungs. And, you know, it's fascinating how people don't really pay attention to all the things they need to get rid of things. You want to have regular bowel function. You want enough water to urinate regularly. You want to make sure that you're breathing, especially now the data is exclusive nasal breathing. And if you get outside and sweat, the skin will help as well. So for instance, I had an 82-year-old woman this last week who had the recent virus. And I don't even mention it by name because I've had things pulled off of the internet by mentioning it. But anyways, she was taking a bunch of nutrients and she wasn't peeing. And her daughter called me and said, look, I'm really concerned about my mom. I think her kidneys are shut down. We gave her more kidney support, but I told her, get outside in a sweatshirt, walk around, break a sweat and ease that. You know what? She went to a walk and oddly enough, sweated a little bit, came in and just urinated like she needed to and normalized her weight. And so it's fascinating how everything works together. Next slide. So Mark Hyman, you know, phenomenal author. What a lot of people may or may not know is when Mark Hyman, before he was the director at Canyon Ranch, he went to the Jeff Bland weekend that Jeff and I taught on detoxification. So he was one of my students before he ever achieved world fame. And here's what he talked about the intense detox week. He said, look, it's short term, it's easy to do. You have nothing to lose. The results can be dramatic, and slow and steady rarely creates this type of change. Next slide. So if we use Synergist, and we'll show the full protocol in a moment, but when we use Ganoderma lucidum, I'll just focus on in the top left, the case of the frozen addicts. That was a group of drug addicts in Southern California in the early 1980s who injected a synthetic heroin called MPTP. They woke up the next morning with Parkinson's and they all went to the hospital, and the doctors on duty said, well, we want some of this stuff. And they said, why would you want some of this stuff? Look what it did to us. And they said, you know, maybe one day we'll find a cure for Parkinson's. So it took them till 2018 to study MPTP and Ganoderma, also known as reishi, but the only substance still found to date that can reverse MPTP-induced Parkinson's. Can also prevent liver failure, pancreatic failure, neural tube defect. And if it can be that good against some of these extreme toxins, just imagine how it works with the daily toxins. Next slide. So what do we do with our detox? Well, we're going to do our specialized pro-resolving mediators. It's going to enhance detox. It's going to enhance recovery. It's going to modulate the inflammatory process. By doing that, it's going to buffer cortisol. We throw in the stress reset along with that as well. And if you go back in your mind to the blood flow, when the body's really stuck in a fight or flight mode, the liver's not getting anywhere near the blood flow, 90 to 95% reduction. Same with the kidneys. So we've got to do that stress reset to prime our organs. Then we give it all the nutrients. So your Power Cleanse, you know, all the great nutrients are going to enhance phase 1 and phase 2 and alkalize to make sure that people can clear these toxins and not be poisoned by the detox. And then the Ganoderma spores. And that is our slam dunk protocol. We combine the stress reset and the detox. You know, I've told people for years, when in doubt, detox. you know, and that's still accurate. But when in doubt, detox and stress reset is the most formidable 1-2 punch that I've seen in now 31 years of clinical efforts. You know what? We can probably back it off there. Since I had the deadly quartet, I was also going to include malnutrition, which, by the way, has been the #1 cause of death now for decades. But any questions about anything at all from you or our viewing audience?
Yeah, I've got a couple of texts. People are texting me questions, Dr. Bob. So first of all, it's fantastic as always. And, you know, when you brought up Dr. Mark Hyman, I remember when one of the reps, Jason Raza from New England, said, we have this new doctor. We really want him to meet Dr. Bland and Dr. Bob. And he was just getting into functional medicine, you know, and here we are years later. And there's tens of thousands of these docs, maybe not at Mark's level, but, you know, we know a lot of their names. And we just want to thank you because you've been a blessing to all these doctors and probably helped millions of people out there. And we're so excited to have you back in October. So a couple of quick questions. One is the SPMs. What dosage are you using for the stress reset? And then what dosage for maybe pain or inflammation?
Well, Jamie, I may go as much as 1 every waking hour, you know, and sometimes we have to give some enzymes with that. But, you know, you would be beyond amazed. You put that in there every waking hour, 2-3 days, people say, oh my gosh, I can move my joints. Oh, the swelling is down. You know, they might lose 3 to 5 pounds of fluid just by getting that under control. And when we couple it with the stress reset, then understand that we're going to put the brakes on aldosterone as well. You know, there's a lot of people in a hyperaldosterone overdrive, and they keep reabsorbing the sodium in the water. Now, part of that is to dilute the toxins that are coming out. Part of it is the stress overdrive, but it gives them bloat. It can give them hypertension. It can cause a lot of problems. And that just tends to just resolve fast with that protocol.
Well, one of the good things that came out of your protocols is that we brought the SPM 120 count. So the patients are able to receive an extra discount just by getting the larger size. And that way, when they do the protocol, the bottle will last more than a couple of days. So
Wow.
that's one question. What about maybe for a inflammatory situation? You mentioned joint health. Will you go that high for a short period of time? And then what's the transition? I know it's always different.
Yeah, well, so yeah, the answer is absolutely yes, I will. And you know, I'm remembering a quote years ago that the most expensive program is the one that doesn't work. You know, and so now, do sometimes people occasionally need to freeze the capsules, take an enzyme with it? Sure, their digestion is so terrible. But once we bring this up to speed, understand digestion will improve, absorption will improve. And if we don't get them enough of a nudge to get out of that trouble, so, you know, how long do they struggle? A couple days, but suddenly they see the light at the end of the tunnel by day 3 or 4. And you know what? People are going to give you a few days. They won't often give you much more. So they want to see some progress.
Yeah, I remember a patient came in, their kid had been suffering with really psoriasis, but it was allergies, food allergies, especially dairy products, right? And his mom was looking at my wall for the MD degree, which was non-existent. And I said to her, how long are you going to come here? She said, I'll give you 1 visit, right? She had been getting allergy shots for 5 years. So, you know, your point of you got to plow through very quickly is well received, because oftentimes we get 1 shot, right? Now, she had been going to the allergen for the allergy shots for 5 years, but us, we may get 1 chance. So one of the questions I got, I have a couple more, but melatonin, every time you mention this, and I watched our last video, the first question comes up is melatonin during the day.
Yeah. And so then I generally, even when patients have that, I'll pull out the World Journal of Gastroenterology and show that the gut makes 400 times the melatonin as the brain. I also show that it binds directly to the adrenal glands and prevents the pituitary drive, the adrenocorticotrophin hormone on the adrenals. So it puts the brakes on stress pretty quick. And then again, the no toxicity.
Yeah. Yeah. I knew he was actually an OBGYN, an endocrinologist, who was prescribing 20 milligrams of melatonin.
Yeah.
And I thought
for this immune, was, right?
Yeah. And for hormonal health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know Dr. Bob presented studies years ago, 20 to 30 milligrams for cancer.
Yeah, so that was National Institutes of Health, and that part of that is what really launched my search into melatonin. And if we seek, we'll find. But they would actually give stage 4 non-operable cancer patients high dose melatonin, and it could be 20 to 50 milligrams at bedtime. And they would give at least 10,000 IU of D3. Now, fast forward, we know D3K2 is a better combo. And, sometimes we're going to measure vitamin D often enough that I might do even 20, 30,000 units of D3K2. We do that for a couple of weeks. We bring that D3 up into that sweet spot, which we could debate on where that is. Functional medicine says 50 to 70. I say between 90 and 110, and NIH will tell you that they can raise blood levels of D3 to up to over 400 in animal studies without toxic side effects. So, the 100 is an arbitrary level.
How did we get from 20 to 30, 20 to 50 milligrams down to a recommended dosage of 1.5 to 3 milligrams of melatonin?
Well, because 1.5 is still going to be effective. It still will be. It's going to be effective for some things, but keep in mind, they didn't have the data that melatonin had a positive effect on all 10 hallmarks of cancer. And I think that's come forward since, when they said, well, these people don't sleep. Let's really blast them with melatonin. It's not toxic. And why not give them D3? Because they associate with D3 with seasonal affect disorder, and, a billion people worldwide deficient. But when you see that extreme case, they all live longer. They stop losing weight. They had, lean tissue breakdown. And the article specifically said that high dose combination prevented neoplastic cachexia, or the cancer breakdown of lean tissue. Super powerful. So if it can do that for the very, very sick, is it going to be harmful to the very healthy? No. Will it be beneficial? Yeah, we've seen it again and again and again.
So I have one question. This may take a couple minutes, but I'm sure we'll talk about this at our professional training event. So to the healthcare professionals out there that lean more towards the allopathic side, what are some of the things you do to help them cross that rickety bridge, right? I had a gentleman come to the A4M at our booth in April and down in Hollywood, and science, and it says there's over 1,000 on SPM alone, right? So with him, the trigger, after 3 Zooms and meetings, we finally got him because he had a personal experience with a product, our GI Complete, which you have on your way to you, both flavors. And he said, this is the first time I ever felt the supplement work. So for him, it was a personal experience. So what are some of your, methods or solutions to helping them with that transition? Because sometimes it's so fear-based and it's so resistant.
Well, we want to get savvy with references in PubMed. So I'll tell the story. I had one of my patients that was at a distance, North Carolina. His wife had a really bad issue with the virus, was in the hospital. The protocol was failing, and she was progressing towards a ventilator. The patient said, Bob, would you do a consult with her doctor and see if they'll add some natural things? So I just went right to PubMed, and I shared the screen, and I typed in melatonin and the virus, which was shown, Ganoderma and the virus, which was shown. Believe it or not, the SPMs were proven in PubMed, direct action against the virus, D3 against the virus, colostrum against the virus, zinc against the virus, quercetin against the virus. And when I showed him all this data, he said, all right, you don't have to tell me anymore. I will sign off on all those things. And instead of her going on a ventilator, she went home 2 days later. So very, very powerful.
I love that method because, you got to, I guess, talk to them in their language. So that's what I was looking for, because that's my biggest challenge. And, I guess if I meet them where they are and show them what they need, then they're on board.
Well, because Jamie, there's so many things that we can share with them, and their literature is more supportive of what we do than what they do. It's very fascinating.
And I remember we were having lunch at one of your events down in Orlando, going back to about 2006. And Dr. Dean Silva, he was a functional medicine cardiologist, having lunch with us. And he had asked you, well, what do I do, with the cardio cocktail, he called it, right? And you says, well, the fact that you're here is great. And, you got to keep your license, but you can do the CoQ10 and the minerals and those things. So, I'm looking to really embrace that community more because, I don't want this division of us versus them anymore. And I think there's there's times and places for everything, but we got to speak to them in their terms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks so much. You're so generous with your time and knowledge. We're so excited to grow together. We look forward to you coming down to Tampa, Florida in October. In the meantime, we got some more events coming on here, and we want to do some more training, of course, on this incredible organic Gano mushroom infused coffee that you've been teaching about all over the world. So thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Hope the family's doing well, and God bless, Dr. Bob.
Well, God bless you and yours. Always a joy.
Thanks, Doc.
Thanks. Have a great day.